afternoon, and thank you all for joining the meeting to discuss the issue paper for the External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Process Initiative. This is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be providing support for the meeting. Let me just go over the agenda. Mark Rutherford, who is ISO's Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, will provide some opening remarks, and then he'll turn the meeting over to Milos Bosanek, the Regional Market Sector Manager who is leading the policy development effort. Milos will provide an overview of the initiative, and then he'll discuss the scope and timeline for each of the two phases. And as noted on this slide, the meeting may wrap up early. However, it is scheduled for 3 hours, just to make sure we have ample time to respond to questions and have a thorough discussion on the issues. To the right of the screen, you'll see a list of additional ISO panel members who are providing support for this initiative. They are available to help respond to questions during this meeting. I won't read everybody's name off, but they are available as well. Let me go to the stakeholder process slide. We are in the early stages of the policy development phase. So we are at the issue paper phase, and we did post the issue paper on August 31st. It is available on the initiative webpage. We also, the presentation that we're reviewing is also available there as well. And Milos will go into a more detailed schedule later on in the presentation. So we are planning to pause for questions, and I'll just wait until that time to provide instructions for how to raise your hand. Just a reminder to please identify yourself before asking your question. We are recording the meeting, and we will post the video file on the initiative webpage. That's for your use. And just as a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark Rutherford.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for participating in this continuing discussion. I want to also welcome everybody to this important stakeholder discussion on scheduling priorities in the ISO market. We really appreciate the thoughtful comments and the feedback as a result of our July 13th kickoff workshop. We also have the additional benefit of operational experience and observations from this summer that we can incorporate into the going forward policy on scheduling priorities. We recognize that the development of scheduling priorities for 2022 and beyond, we are really tasked with really harmonizing between centralized market concepts and OAK frameworks. And we also recognize that this balancing act between the confidence and the priorities of serving native load, as well as providing confidence and a mechanism for knowing if you can get through the system, through the transmission of the system for serving other load through the system is a fundamental concept of open access. I guess in reviewing the comments from the July 13th, there certainly was some common level agreement about the need to move or consider a transmission reservation process. But I think there was also strong recognition that doing that too quickly has some perils and needs to be done thoughtfully. And so the result of the comments that we received indicated that while we should be pursuing the reservation concept, we need to do it carefully, and we need to do it and not try to rush into it for necessarily 2022. So I think we're at a point now where we are committed to exploring and developing that transmission reservation concept. And we want to do that through a stakeholder process, combination of stakeholder process and maybe some working groups to help define that and really thoughtfully design it well. In the meantime, we also have to bridge how to get there.
On 1 second. There we go. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry about that.
So as we are working on the longer term and exploring the transmission reservation approach for the longer term, we recognize that we also have to continue to operate and perhaps bridge through next summer until we get to that longer term solution. And I think the stakeholder comments also highlighted some real substantive things that we could things we can do to enhance the where we ended up in 2021 this summer, how we enhance that through some transparency and maybe some substantive enhancements to the scheduling priorities for next summer. So I think what we are looking forward to is a active, constructive engagement, collaborative engagement to do both that outlining of the longer term, but also maybe in a more timely basis, look at what we can do and really narrow down those things we can do in the near term for 2022 as we look forward to next summer. And I think that's going to be the effort and that we are undertaking. So again, I thank everybody's efforts on this. I know this is an important item for not just California, but everybody across the West. It's an important opportunity to rebuild relationships in a constructive way. And we really look forward to your input and your active engagement in the solutions for both the near term and the long term on the scheduling priorities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so Milos Pasanik is going to provide an overview of the initiative next. So go ahead, Milos.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Mark, for the opening remarks. Can you hear me okay, Christina?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, we're going to discuss the concepts and the scope items described in the issue paper that we published at the end of August. Like Mark said, we received very constructive and extensive stakeholder comments that ultimately helped shape the scope items for both phases of the initiative, and we look forward to continuing the collaborative dialogue on this very important topic. We're going to do a brief review of the background of the initiative and then spend the majority of the time talking about the proposed scope items for the different phases. The scope items were heavily informed by stakeholder presentations during the kickoff July 13th stakeholder workshop, and then subsequent written comments that we got in early August. There's going to be an opportunity to comment on the scope items and the direction of both phases since we're at the issue paper stage, and we certainly look forward to that feedback. And based on these comments that we receive on the issue paper, there may be additional items considered that will be identified in a future straw proposal as part of the scope of the initiative. So we will start with an overview of the background of the initiative, and then we're going to shift into a more detailed discussion on phase 1 and phase 2 items. And as I walk through the different slides, I'm going to pause at different points, and we'll have some time at the end of the meeting as well for questions. With that, let's briefly then shift to providing the initiative overview. All right. So earlier this year, we undertook a fast-tracked initiative evaluating market enhancements in preparation for this summer 2021, and the anticipated challenging system conditions for this summer. One of the topics addressed in that summer readiness initiative was the development of enhancements to the export load and wheeling scheduling priorities, and those enhancements would be in effect or were aimed to be in effect starting this summer. And we ultimately implemented those enhancements in early August of this year. And in that initiative, we recognized the need to evaluate and develop a more holistic, a more long-term framework for establishing scheduling priorities in our market. On July 13th, then, we held our stakeholder kickoff workshop, which explores the long-term holistic framework for establishing scheduling priorities, but it also explores near-term enhancements to the scheduling priorities that could be in place by next summer to improve the current framework. So we got a lot of good feedback, good suggestions for enhancements. We look to scope those into the different phases, and I'm going to talk through those a bit later in the presentation. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So I want to briefly touch on the current framework and role of scheduling priorities for market. I think this is going to help set the context for the enhancements we're going to be discussing through the different phases. In the organized market context, the ISO manages schedules on its grid through the day-ahead and real-time markets. And in these markets, scheduling priorities dictate the order of curtailment of subschedules when the market cannot find a feasible solution. So when parties submit self-schedule offers in the market, if there is sufficient generation and transmission capacity to support those self-schedule, the market is going to uphold those. But to the extent that there's not sufficient supply or there are binding transmission constraints or limitations, there may be a need to curtail self-schedules to clear the market. And these curtailments are based on market penalty parameters that ultimately reflect the different scheduling priorities dictating the order of curtailment. And in this context, transactions with lower scheduling priority are curtailed ahead of higher priority transactions. So let's go to the next slide.
A quick reminder to the speakers to please mute your phone. I'm getting some back. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So through the market enhancements for summer 2021 initiative, which we completed early in the year, we proposed enhancements to scheduling priorities, which were subsequently approved by FERC in June. And these enhancements develop the requirements for exports to establish high scheduling priority equal to load. And then similarly, we established the concept of high priority wheel-through transactions with a priority equal to load, and then low priority wheel-through transactions. And these wheel-through priorities are interim in nature and in place through the end of May of next year. And wheel-through transactions can establish a high scheduling priority equal to load by identifying 45 days prior to the start of the month that the wheel-through transaction is supported by a firm supply contract with an external load for the entirety of the month. And then also there's the requirement to attest that the transaction is supported by secured firm transmission to the ISO border for the month. Export transactions can similarly establish a high scheduling priority equal to load by sourcing the generation from non-resource adequacy capacity and confirming that the load serving entity outside of the ISO has rights, contractual rights to that capacity. And to the extent that these requirements are met, then both export and wheel-through transactions have that high scheduling priority equal to load. But to the extent the requirements are not met, then these transactions would have a low scheduling priority for purposes of applying those scheduling priorities and curtailments to self-schedules when the market cannot find a feasible solution. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so with that background in mind, this is the last slide, and I'll pause for questions after this. But with that background in mind, the initiative is going to move forward at this stage in two concurrently run phases, similarly to what we initially identified in the July 13th workshop. Phase one is going to focus on the near-term enhancements to the scheduling priorities process and those enhancements that can be adequately vetted by March of next year, and when we'll talk more about the schedule, and that can be implemented by summer of next year. And we're going to talk more about the different scope items in the subsequent slides, but based on stakeholder feedback, phase one of the initiative will include a number of transparency enhancements suggested by stakeholders, as well as a number of substantive enhancements that stakeholders identified in their comments and their presentations. Phase two of the initiative is going to focus more on that long-term holistic framework for establishing scheduling priorities. And based on stakeholder comments, as well as our own evaluation, we're proposing to develop a forward transmission reservation process for establishing scheduling priorities in our market. And to help us further develop the structure of that framework for transmission reservations and establishing scheduling priorities, we're proposing setting up collaborative stakeholder working groups to help us leverage the expertise and experiences of our regional partners in operating under a transmission reservation process for the better part of 2 decades, as well as I think these stakeholder working groups can help us build consensus and then facilitate an expedited policy development process on phase two in particular. As I noted, we're going to talk more in depth about both of these phases and the subsequent and the substantive scope items in each, and we're going to talk about those in the subsequent slides. But let me pause here for questions at this stage on the initiative overview before we get into the details of the different phases.
So if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the WebEx raise hand icon if you dialed in using the connection information that showed up in WebEx, or dial #2 on your telephone keypad if you dialed in with separate information. You'll hear a notification or beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, please state your name and affiliation.
The raise hand icon is on the top right of the chat screen.
Okay, I currently see no incoming questions.
Okay. Well, there'll be opportunities as well then towards the end of the meeting if anybody wants to come back to any of the items that we might have discussed earlier, if you think of any questions as well at that point. So let's then shift to a more detailed discussion on the phase 1 scope of the initiative. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So we received a number of stakeholder comments with enhancement suggestions for phase 1 of the initiative that could be pursued by next summer. These suggestions primarily focused on transparency enhancements, the provision of additional data or information or clarifications, and then substantive enhancements were suggested as well to the scheduling priorities process. These items have been scoped into phase 1, and I'm going to go over them in more detail in some of the subsequent slides. But let me first start with the next few slides are just going to focus on the transparency enhancements. We'll pause for questions after those. On the transparency enhancements, as I noted, stakeholders suggested additional data and information that could help them inform the risk of curtailment and improve overall situational awareness of conditions on the ISO grid that ultimately could impact different types of transactions. As an overview, the transparency enhancements that we're scoping in are consolidation of terms across various documents and the consolidation of business practice requirements regarding exports and wheeling processes. We'll talk more about each one of these in subsequent slides. Another one is provisioning of curtailment data and information when these curtailments occur in the market, providing it promptly after the event. And then providing aggregate data on RA import and high priority wheel registrations at different points. And then as well as providing data on load forecast adjustments that may occur in the residual unit commitment process. Today, these are not necessarily published on OASIS, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. But in the next slides, I'm going to go into details on each one of these topics, and additional details as well can be found in the issue paper. I'll pause for questions, like I said, after we go through a number of these slides that cover on transparency enhancements, and then before jumping into the substantive enhancements part of phase 1. Okay, so a couple of stakeholders indicated the need to review the terms that are used across different documents to ensure there's consistency across those different documents, whether it's the tariff, business practices, or system guides, as well as consolidating concepts into a single document or guide that describes the different processes that are relevant to exports or wheeling transactions across the ISO system, including the process for establishing the different high and low scheduling priorities. Stakeholders noted that this type of review and consolidation would not only provide additional clarity on these critical concepts, but it can also facilitate contracting by having clear terms and clear documents that capture the entire, or as much as possible, the entirety of the export and wheel-through processes across the ISO system. So we're going to be scoping this item into phase 1, and we're going to review the tariff, business practices, and system guide terms to ensure that there's consistency when it comes to, in particular, establishing the different scheduling priorities in our market. We're aware of some inconsistencies in terminology between business practices and system guides, and we're going to look to address those but as well, we're going to do a more comprehensive review to make sure that we capture other terms that may be inconsistent across different documents. We're also going to work to develop an addendum that consolidates the relevant concepts that are currently spread across multiple business practices. This will be an addendum, very likely an addendum to another business practice, that just provides a single place that captures the relevant information regarding export and wheel-through transactions across our system. I think we ultimately recognize that these are very complex issues that are essentially increasingly becoming more complex as we evaluate the different policies. And if stakeholders would find the consolidation of information beneficial, we can certainly make that happen. So that's one. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So the next transparency enhancement that we scoped into phase one of the initiative is the stakeholder suggestion of providing additional data and information on the impacts of curtailments on different types of transactions, wheels and exports, whether those are high or low priority transactions. So we're going to scope this into phase one as well, providing this curtailment data in real time soon after the issuance of the curtailment and identifying the aggregate impact on different types of transactions. This will provide, I think, additional real-time visibility on the impacts of these curtailments, but we also need to evaluate the necessary systems to support the provisioning of this type of information. We currently don't provide it necessarily in real time or soon after the event. We don't necessarily gather that information in a single place, but it's more an after-the-fact function. And so along those lines, I just want to point out that we currently do provide curtailment impacts and curtailment information after the fact through the summer market performance report that we started publishing earlier this summer in June. And these are monthly reports intended really for the summer months in particular. These provide aggregate data across the month on curtailment impacts of different types of transactions, including wheels and exports, whether those are high or low priority. But as I noted, these reports are intended really to be for the summer months only at this stage, and I think moving to the provisioning of this curtailment information closer to real time after the event, I think will fill that void and will provide the information year-round after these reports cease for the summer months. So to the extent that market participants need information on how their individual transactions were affected by a curtailment, that is something that we cannot necessarily make public, but participants can work through their client reps or account managers to request this type of information for their own transactions to the extent those are not adequately visible through the different systems and the tools that we provide today. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this next transparency enhancement that we're scoping into phase one based on stakeholder suggestions is to provide aggregate data on resource adequacy import showings at different tie points, and as well as aggregate high priority wheel registration data at import and export points. This information, I think, was requested and I think helped support a few stakeholders requested, and it helps support and inform the different types of transactions across the tie points across our system, but primarily can provide insights into the risk of curtailment based on the amount of transactions at different tie points. Stakeholders were looking for that type of information to help inform that risk. And we'll be scoping this item into phase one, as I said, and we'll be looking to provide historical aggregate data on monthly resource adequacy import showings at different tie points going back a year to 18 months. We're still working on that data, but one data point that we'll provide is historical data on a monthly basis on aggregate import showings at different tie points. And this historical information can probably help inform future business decisions of different types of market participants. We're also going to look to provide aggregate data on registered high priority wheels at import and export points, kind of a running total that's updated as new registrations come in that meet the necessary requirements. And additionally, we'll be looking to provide aggregate RA import data at tie points based on the most recent monthly resource adequacy plans that are submitted. We're currently working on all of these items, gathering the data, evaluating whether there is a way to automate publication and development of some of these reports in lieu of gathering it manually. But we do recognize the stakeholder request and the benefit of this information, and we will effort to provide it as soon as possible. And it's likely that some of this information can be made available later this month as we're working through it. In this space as well, some stakeholders requested additional information that's already publicly available that also helps supplement and create that situational awareness of transactions at different tie points or commitments at different tie points. And we provide links in the issue paper, but the requested information that stakeholders asked for included MIC allocations at different tie points, and we make this information currently available on our website as we go through the MIC allocation process. We also make available information on transmission ownership rights and existing transmission contracts that are in place at different tie points that we respect, as well as the current ATC or scheduling limits at tie points. That particular information is available on OASIS. So in the issue paper, as I said, we go a little bit more in depth on each one of these items, but we primarily provide the links to that information on our website that's currently available and publicly available. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so stakeholders also requested that the ISO provide additional transparency regarding operator adjustments to load forecast in the RUC process. And while today we do publish the day-ahead load forecast, we do not publish on OASIS adjustments to these forecasts in RUC. And so making the load forecast adjustment values available on OASIS soon after the adjustment or soon after that action can provide some additional situational awareness for market participants. If it provides value to stakeholders, we're going to make this information available, and this will take some system enhancements in order to support this information being available on OASIS, and we're going to look to make this available as soon as possible. We should have a better estimate by the time of the straw proposal as we evaluate the system needs to provide this information. We do currently publish information on RUC load forecast adjustments, but we do provide it after the fact. So in the day ahead, in the new day ahead daily, in the daily day ahead summer report, that's a mouthful, daily day ahead summer report, we publish information daily on the prior day's load conditions, including load forecasts, as well as RUC adjustments to those forecasts. These daily reports started in early August, and the report is compiled manually. But the intent was to make the information available during only the summer months that we would publish these manual reports. And then publication of RUC load forecast adjustments in real time, I think, would obviate the need for some of these after the fact reports, if we can do that promptly. And also the summer market performance report that I mentioned earlier as well, those reports that are published on a monthly basis provide some additional after the fact information on RUC forecast adjustments. But similarly, again, these reports are planned only really for the summer months at this stage and not year-round. So moving to that real-time publication of those forecast adjustments would allow for timely publication of the information year-round and less dependence on these after-the-fact reports. So let's pause here then for questions. These are the transparency enhancements that we've scoped in at this stage that we've identified in the issue paper. Next, we're going to move to the substantive enhancements, but I want to pause here to see if there's any questions on the transparency aspects.
We'll go ahead and move to the first caller.
Hi, good afternoon. Tyler Moore, APS. I think this is related a little bit to the scope item on page 12. And so what we're seeing right now, or what more transparency on what's getting curtailed, is at times there's RUC awards that are less than what's being E-tagged, and we're unable to see from a sync BA perspective the risk that's coming to us as a BA from those over-tagging instances. So one request would be the ability to notify sync VAs of when they have e-tags coming to them that are above the RUC award. So I think it's similar in nature to this kind of curtailment, but more coming from the RUC market process into the next day.
No, I appreciate that. I think that certainly goes hand in hand. So please, if you wouldn't mind, note that in your comments on the issue paper. I think those are due by the end of the month. But please do note that, and we'll certainly consider it. See what we can do in providing that data as well.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the next caller.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. First of all, I want to say thank you guys very much for taking on these additional transparency enhancement elements. I think, having more transparency in the market is obviously a good thing. So wanted to just, let you guys know that we really appreciate that effort. But my question is, as you guys kind of go through each of these elements and kind of think about the format that the data is going to be provided, if it's going to be provided in an Excel file, OASIS, PDF report, if there's going to be an opportunity for stakeholders to provide any feedback on that, just so we can give some thoughts on kind of from more of an end user perspective.
Yeah. No, that's a great question and great suggestion. I think we can certainly do that. I think we do want to vet the look and feel of these and make sure, I think some of this information lends itself better to being in an Excel sheet so that parties can query that information better and pick the information they ultimately need. So I think that's a great suggestion. Let us think about that internally and see what's the best way that we could, get that stakeholder feedback. Maybe that's something I was envisioning we can circle back with certain folks offline to make sure, it addresses their needs, particularly the entities that made the suggestion. But I think posting something more broadly for stakeholders to take a look and make sure that look and feel meets their need, I think that's a great idea. Let us think about that offline, how best we can do that, and see if you can note that in your comments as well.
Okay, no, I really appreciate that. You guys have quite a bit of data out there already, and we've found that some formats are more user-friendly than others. So yeah, if we have an opportunity to provide some feedback on kind of the direction you guys are headed with that would be great. Thank you.
Perfect. No, great suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, we do have another question, but before that, just a reminder that you can use the raise hand icon located above the chat there, or you can use #2 on your telephone keypad. So we'll go to that next caller.
Hi, Milos. Ian White with Shell Energy. Just to echo Callie's points, we really appreciate your leaning in on this and including the transparency elements and just the overall sort of collaborative dialogue in this stakeholder process with a variety of different stakeholders and entities. So thank you for that. One thing I just wanted to point out, it sounds like the additional transparency elements that are discussed here will likely be reported in a number of different reports, some in the sort of special summer reports, as you pointed out. I was just hoping that in this stakeholder process, if the ISO could publish maybe a cheat sheet that shows which information will be hosted in which report, so that if it's going to not be all in one place, to point stakeholders in the right direction, so that we can get access to the information and make sense of it, and two, to Callie's point, eventually be able to provide some stakeholder feedback. That would really help us so that we're not digging through things blindly.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion as well. Let us think about how we can best capture where this information is going across both different reports, but as well as we have a number of different forums where we discuss particular information. We have the market planning performance forum, for example. Let us let us go back and think about internally how we can best capture where some of this information is, like you said, a cheat sheet, but also what are the different forums where even beyond the summer, some of this information can be shared and discussed. So great suggestion. Let us go back and consider that as well. And if you wouldn't mind, note that in your comments as well.
Well, yeah, certainly will do. A page of, even if it's a one-page sort of one-page document with links and like an FAQ document or something would be great. Thanks again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Marvin, do we have anybody else in the queue?
Currently seeing no additional callers in queue.
Okay, well, let's then go, I think, maybe was it slide 16? Or is it 15? Okay, perfect. Okay, so then we talked about the transparency enhancements. Let's now talk about the substantive enhancements for phase 1 that can be vetted and implemented by next summer. So stakeholders suggested a number of enhancements to the current priorities that we proposed that they be in scope of phase 1 and that we'll evaluate ahead of publication of the straw proposal. I'm going to go over these a bit more in detail, similar to what we did with the previous slides, but just wanted to provide an overview here and of the different items that we're going to cover. So evaluation of retaining high priority export status in certain instances when the sum of schedules from the supporting resource exceeds the non-RA capacity. That's something we'll cover in the next slide. Then consideration of mitigating impacts of underproduction of resources that are supporting high priority export schedules, and then as well as measures to minimize unnecessary over curtailment of high priority transactions. We're going to pause after we finish going through these substantive enhancements. I'll pause for any questions. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we will be scoping in then the stakeholder suggested item that high priority exports should have the ability to retain high priority status for at least a portion of the self-schedule when the sum of schedules from a supporting resource exceeds the non-RA capacity. So this is a mouthful, so let me see, I'll break it down with a couple of examples as well. But currently, if the sum of high priority export self-schedules exceeds the non-RA capacity of the supporting resource, all those high priority export schedules revert to low priority status. So to illustrate this with just simplistic numbers, if the supporting resource, the non-RA capacity from that supporting resource is 100 megawatts, but the sum of high priority export self-schedules is 150 megawatts, all the high priority export schedules revert to low priority status. So, anybody that had high priority schedules, everything reverts to low priority in that instance. And this is because I think this was designed like this because the ISO did not necessarily want to be determining which transactions should retain high priority export status among the different off-takers that the resource may have contractual relationships with. But the expectation was that the scheduling coordinator for the resource would communicate with those off-takers to inform accurate self-schedule submission so that there wouldn't be this instance of those self-schedules exceeding the non-RA capacity of the resource. So what we're going to be considering is whether there's a viable approach for the scheduling coordinator of the resource to check the non-RA capacity at any given moment prior to market close and to communicate that to its off-takers, the parties that are submitting those self-schedules, in order to avoid submission of high priority export self-schedules above the non-RA capacity of the resource. Similarly, we're going to explore methods for potentially allowing retention of high priority export status for at least a portion of the self-schedule up to the non-RA capacity of the supporting resource. So, for example, if there's one off-taker submitting a high priority export schedule from that resource, that can be a relatively straightforward approach potentially of decreasing the amount of the high priority export schedule to the non-RA capacity. So in that example, if the non-RA capacity is 100 megawatts, but that one high priority export submitted 110 megawatt self-schedule, this could be, it's simplistic in that one off-taker scenario where you could reduce the high priority self-scheduled to be 100, and then the remaining 10 are low priority self-schedule. But it gets a little bit more complicated when there are multiple off-takers submitting high priority self-schedules that are supported by the same resource. So there will need to be some consideration potentially of prorating the non-RA capacity among the multiple high priority self-schedules rather than reverting everybody to low priority status. Or otherwise, there could be some consideration or providing a way for the scheduling resource to indicate the proportionality of the high priority export schedule reductions in some way, depending on the type of arrangements that they have with those different off-takers. But we can consider different approaches. We understand what the stakeholder concern is and what the challenge is here. So we'll evaluate this particular item and have something to share at the straw proposal stage, a proposal for stakeholders to review and see what may work best in this situation. So let's go to the next slide then. Okay. So the next enhancement suggested by stakeholders was that will be also scoped into phase 1 is related to mitigation of impacts of underproduction of resources supporting high priority exports. So in stress system conditions, underproducing resources that are supporting high priority exports could potentially adversely affect the ISO's ability to manage the grid reliably. Deviations from schedules by underproducing resources place the burden on the ISO to make up that difference in generation and support the export schedule. And in tight supply and stress system conditions, this could pose a challenge. Along those lines, we could consider potentially requiring an attestation of production capability closer to real-time bid submission deadline to ensure that the resource reasonably expects to be able to support that high priority self-schedule. But additionally, in challenging system conditions, there could be consideration of, the high priority export schedule supported by that underproducing resource to be curtailed prior to the ISO load as opposed to being on par with ISO load. But, this would require consideration of potential threshold of underproduction where some of these actions could take place compared to the high priority export schedule that would trigger that particular action. I think we need to acknowledge also that this can become very complicated to unwind when there's a single resource that may be supporting both export transactions as well as RA transactions. How can, to which transaction can the underproduction be attributed, if it can be attributed at all? So I think it raises some challenging questions that we'll have to evaluate. So we'll need to consider and vet this item further ahead of the straw proposal and consider, is there a viable approach in this framework by next summer in light of where we're looking to go as part of the long-term framework. So this is something that we'll evaluate, but I think it's important to recognize there are some challenges associated with this particular topic, especially when you have multiple different types of transactions that are supported by that single resource that may be underproducing compared to those schedules. Let's go to the next slide then. So then stakeholders also suggested enhancements to minimize unnecessary over-curtailment, and the concern expressed here was that when the market is not feasible and the ISO has to curtail sub-schedules, high priority sub-schedules and RA import transactions may be curtailed without valid E-tags yet being in place that include a transmission profile. And if the RA import without E-tags, if those are to the extent that RA import without an E-tag is not curtailed, but it also doesn't materialize or doesn't ultimately flow for whatever reason, the ISO may have unnecessarily cut wheels or other imports that otherwise could have flowed absent, those curtailments and absent that RA import that's not tagged, not materializing. So stakeholders suggested issuing curtailments based upon valid E-tags that have a transmission profile, particularly that the ISO consider requiring day-ahead tags for RA imports and high priority wheels. And the idea there being, to the extent those E-tags are submitted, those parties, in order to submit an E-tag, they have to identify a source and they have to secure transmission across different systems in order to be able to submit that ETAG. And if all that information is in place, then it decreases the risk that these are speculative transactions or that they might not show up ultimately when called upon. Other stakeholders suggested that the ISO wait until the T-minus 20 minutes timeline, 20 minutes prior to flow, to issue curtailment instead of requiring a day-ahead ETAG. And what we're noted in the issue paper is that we're going to consider these suggestions along with consideration of the role of the current requirement that imports have to have a valid transmission profile by T-minus 40 minutes and the application of the current financial penalties, the intertax settlement deviation penalties, if the imports are not tagged by that time. So, we'll consider those stakeholder suggestions. We understand the issue and the stakeholder concerns that we may be curtailing transactions that ultimately do not have an ETAG, and we may be curtailing some transactions in favor of others, and if certain transactions ultimately don't end up flowing, then we may have curtailed legitimate wheel-through or import transactions that otherwise would have flowed. And so we understand that issue, and we'll evaluate the impact and the potential approaches in time for the next straw proposal based on those stakeholder suggestions. Let's go to the next slide, and I think we'll pause after that. Actually, we'll go through this next slide, and we'll go through the timeline slide, and then we'll pause at that point for questions. I wanted to talk about some suggestions that we proposed in the paper that these not be in scope for phase one, primarily because the compressed timeline of phase one of the initiative would not necessarily allow for robust and proper vetting of the policy implications, or the implementation would be challenged by next summer. But also because some of these items suggested are either not compatible with the long-term framework where we're going, and that would require some unwinding at a later stage, or some of these, or one of these would be better addressed under a transmission reservation process framework, which is what we're proposing to move toward in phase two of the initiative. So I'll go through these items, and they're also elaborated in the issue paper. But the California Joint Load Serving Entities suggested development of a simplified transmission reservation process for establishing scheduling priorities in time for implementation by next summer, so summer of 2022. And after evaluation internally and discussion, we think that this process would be fairly challenging to implement and vet adequately by next summer. The process would consist, as described, of simplified studies to determine the native load needs, as well as it would rely on MIC allocations to determine whether wheeling transactions can reserve transmission in advance in an annual or monthly time frame. But as I said, such a framework requires, I think, careful vetting of challenging and contested policy issues that we just don't think can be adequately vetted in the compressed time frame or the rush time frame by next March, and certainly challenging to implement by June of next year, a couple of months after the March time frame. A simplified study process may not adequately account for the transmission capacity needed to serve native load, nor the amount of transition that may otherwise be available for other types of transactions. Moreover, I think there are a number of issues that would be left unaddressed in a simplified framework, such as whether parties that are reserving transmission across the monthly or the annual time frames and securing those high priority scheduling rights, whether they should be eligible for allocations of congestion revenue rights in those time frames if they're reserving that transmission and paying for it. There will likely need to be a need to change and consider CRR allocation changes to the timelines in order to facilitate this type of a process that we don't think it's a small task in and of itself. So we don't believe that such an approach is necessarily viable for next summer, and we can focus our attention on the development of the long-term framework, which along those same lines explores or evaluates development of a forward transmission reservation process, and we can dedicate our time to that robust policy development of a transmission reservation process, one that I think we can be more assured can address the different issues and the needs more holistically, but I think also can withstand FERC review. So for those reasons, we noted in the issue paper that, we don't think this item is viable for next summer just because of the timing that's needed to vet the policy in such a short time, a number of unresolved issues that are fairly challenging to address, and then the implementation challenges themselves as well of moving to that transmission reservation process by next summer. Bank also suggested permitting multiple supporting resources to be allowed to support a single high priority export schedule with non-RA capacity. So instead of just one resource supporting multiple schedules, this is multiple individual resources supporting a single schedule, kind of grouping of resources and capacity into one to support a single high priority export schedule. This is a highly complex change to implement. I think it raises a number of implementation issues that just we don't think can be addressed and implemented by next summer, aside from some of the policy challenges that it may raise in tracking the non-RA capacity across multiple resources that's supporting a single high priority export. This approach also is likely incompatible with the forward transmission reservation process, as I think a single reservation to establish scheduling priority cannot adequately capture, the flows and the impacts of multiple generators spread across the system that may be supporting a single export. I think Bank also suggested that the ISO should consider enhancements that would prevent the rounding down of schedules, export schedules to the nearest whole number. And I think in the issue paper, we clarified a little bit, the ISO practice, that the ISO does not round down export schedules, but rather we require submission in whole numbers, not fractional numbers. And the reason for that is that the tagging requirement on interchange transactions require that these tags be in whole numbers under NASD guidelines. So parties, under our current tools in cyber, parties can choose when submitting that export subschedule whether they want to round up or if they want to round down the value. But we do not round down those values, as the system requires submission in whole number increments. And then finally, I think the California LSCs also suggested evaluating the deliverability of high priority exports to the export point, prior to allowing those, the high priority export self-schedules, and a forward transmission reservation process that we'll talk a little bit later in phase 2, I think will provide that ability to more adequately evaluate deliverability based on whether there is sufficient transmission capacity to secure high priority or high scheduling priority across our system. Conducting a comprehensive analysis or additional validation on each high priority export transaction at this stage, in light of all the other transactions that may have been awarded, I think will be fairly complex and not necessarily feasible by next summer, absent some robust evaluation process. But we do agree that this is an issue and should be evaluated in this initiative, and we think that this is something that, as we move on to phase 2 item, it's something that can be addressed more adequately. So let's go then to the next slide. There you go, on the timeline, and then we'll pause here for questions on some of the more recent slides that we covered. So talking a bit about the phase 1 schedule, both phases, as I mentioned earlier, are going to run concurrently, both phase 1 and phase 2. But I'm going to talk more specifically on phase 2 schedule a bit later. In terms of phase 1, we're targeting issuance of the straw proposal towards the end of October. Here we're targeting October 5th, as you can see on the slide. And then with a draft final proposal in December, and then a final proposal in early February of next year. All this ultimately taking us to the March EIM governing body and ISO board meetings of 2022. And by going to the March board meetings for decision, it gives us a couple of months for the necessary filing, but FERC review in time to get that decision by June and then be able to implement those enhancements. So let me pause now here and see if there are questions on the substantive enhancements or the schedule.
Okay, and as a reminder, you can use the WebEx raise hand icon located right above the chat there, or you can use #2 on your telephone keypad if you dialed in separately. So we have one here. Let me go ahead and unmute this caller. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Leah Fisher with Public Generating Pool. Milos, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So my question is back on slide 18. And I was just hoping you could share just a little bit more about CAISO's initial reactions to the proposal to consider day-ahead e-tags as a way to minimize the risk of over-curtailment. Just wondering, I know you're going to put out some thoughts in the straw proposal, but are there any downsides or concerns to this proposal on day-ahead e-tags that you can articulate for us today?
I'll talk a little bit about it, but I think we'll have still some additional discussions internally for the straw proposal. I think one concern has been, and I think it's not necessarily unique that this type of proposal has come up in this initiative. It's come up particularly in the RA import space, as well as in a couple of other areas. I think the main concern with day-ahead e-tags that we'll have to evaluate is just the feasibility of it and the implications that it may have on the resource adequacy import space. If, today there's not necessarily a day-ahead e-tag requirement, and so in order to submit an e-tag, you would need to know both the source of the generation in the day ahead, as well as you would need to have secured the transmission by the day-ahead time frame across all the intervening systems to the sync point in order to be able to submit that e-tag. And so it's a different paradigm that has some implications in the RA space that we'll need to consider, because it would require then that RA imports have the source identified in the day-ahead time frame and that they have secured the transmission by the day-ahead time frame, even though they may have to then potentially have a must-offer obligation in real time, and if they're ultimately not awarded, there could be some cost associated with that transmission. So there's a number of things to consider and implications, and the interplay with the RA program. Is this the space to address this issue or consider it more robustly, or is there a different place where we can consider this particular issue more robustly? And I think then, I believe it was Shell as well in their comments that raised some concern with a day-ahead tagging requirement, because it's not, while it's a common practice, it's not necessarily a requirement, as they noted it, and it may have some unintended consequences on the ability of parties to make certain adjustments if there's a tag in the day-ahead time frame. So we'll certainly take all that into account. We need to also keep in mind that we have a requirement today in place that import tags have to be submitted, transmission profiles of a tag has to be submitted by the T-40 time frame, T-40 minutes. And that's something as well that we can consider, if we are considering imports that meet those requirements when we're issuing curtailment. So there's a number of options for us to consider and implications that we have to think through a bit more, and what are those interplays with other processes and other policies that we'll need to consider in time for publication of the straw proposal on this item. But we certainly understand the benefits of tagging and the day-ahead tagging requirement, but we also do want to make sure that we're considering the impacts on other processes and other policies.
Great, thank you. That's helpful color. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
We'll take the next caller. And Kanya, you are unmuted. Please make sure your device is also unmuted.
Hi, this is Kanya Dorlin with the Public Advocate's Office. I did have one question on, the topic was brought up on slide 10, the recommendations that are not in scope. I just wanted to, it's page 19. Wanted to better understand, so forward transmission reservations, are those things that in other RTOs, entities have to pay a fee for forward transmission reservation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We'll talk about that more in detail when we get into phase 2, but those ISOs and RTOs that have a forward transmission reservation process as a requirement to participate in the market, there is a rate associated with the transmission service that they're reserving. So they would have to pay for that particular transmission that they're reserving.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, we'll take the next caller. And Brian, you should be able to speak.
Yes, thank you. Hey, Milosh, Brian Baker with Middle River. I wanted to ask you a philosophical question about the second of your proposed substantive enhancements. I don't want to read too much into it, and forgive me if I do, but this seems to be driving toward a supporting resource having to provide an amount of energy that's equal to the export schedule, self-schedule that they're backing. Am I reading too much into that? Is that where the ISO is intending to drive this issue?
I think you are probably reading a bit too much into that. We're not necessarily driving there at this stage yet. We're just teeing up the issue and recognize that this is a challenge. Let me see what the issue is. Oh, the underproduction. Yeah. I think we're just teeing it up at this stage, and we'll evaluate what may be feasible in this space, recognizing the challenge as well. But we haven't yet made up our mind ultimately how best to address and what may be feasible, if at all. As I think I noted when I was going through this slide, we certainly recognize the challenge when you have, a single resource supporting different types of transactions, both exports and resource adequacy transactions. I think we certainly recognize the challenge in that space to figure out, if a resource is underproducing, how do you attribute, is there, can you attribute can you track, a certain amount of that energy as being associated with the export compared to the RA transaction, when looking at the underproduction. And I think that's a challenge that we'll need to wrestle with and figure out, is there anything viable at this near-term stage that we can do, if at all?
Okay, thanks, Milosh. That's helpful. I agree it's a complex issue. I will up my medication a little bit and follow this as it progresses. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, we'll take the next caller.
Hey, Milosh, this is Michelle Tito from the CPUC. I just wanted to mention one issue that doesn't look like it's in scope, and I just wanted to raise it. So in the last FERC order, in response to CAISO's comments, I believe CAISO indicated that CPMs and RMRs are not RA. So imagine, so the thing I'm thinking about is the post-HASP process, and this is for allocation of internal transmission capability. So CAISO will only consider the wheel versus the RA resources in the north when they're allocating, constrained transmission north to south. I think it makes sense to also include RMRs and CPM in that. I think one of the things is that, RMRs and CPMs are procured as backstop capacity. They're subject to RAIM. They sort of look and feel like RA, where they're procured precisely for RA purposes. And so it would seem only logical to include them in the post-HASP allocation process when you're trying to allocate the north to south transmission capability. Just wondering if you understood that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm totally explaining that clearly, but I just wanted to raise that as a really important issue from our perspective.
No, I appreciate it. No, thank you, Michelle. And I think you raise a interesting point to consider. And since we're at the issue paper stage, I'd encourage you to submit that as a suggestion item in scope. I think, in that case, there's different types of CPM that I think it would be good to evaluate in that context, which one, what type of CPM ultimately, fits into that post-HASP process. But I think by all means, I'd encourage you to submit that as a comment, and we'll certainly consider it, including it in scope as we move towards the straw proposal.
Okay, so just one additional point that I wanted to make. In some cases, resources can't count as RA. So imagine that a resource becomes COD after T-30, and so it can't count as RA because CAISO can't upload it onto a supply plan. So even though it might be under RA contract, CAISO might give it a CPM so that it looks and feels like RA. And under that circumstance, it is actually RA, right? It's procured as RA. It just can't be shown. And in particular, under those circumstances, it seems like those should be considered in that post-HASP allocation process, and as well as RMRs, since, in-state resources are paying for those resources. So anyway, that's just a little further color. Thanks so much.
No, appreciate it. No, and please do note that nuance as well. This is something we can certainly consider and evaluate.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, Marvin?
Currently see no additional questions at this time.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's then go. There you go. Okay, so let's now shift to more discussion on phase 2 of the initiative. This phase focuses on the long-term framework for establishing scheduling priorities in our market. And as I said at the beginning, we certainly receive very constructive and helpful comments on that long-term framework topic, which emphasizes, I think, the importance of being deliberate and thorough in developing this framework collaboratively. So let's go to the next slide. Jump right into it then. And I'll pause again at different places in this presentation a couple of different times. So as I noted, stakeholder comments supported development of a forward transmission reservation process for establishing priorities in our market, and as a way of bridging important themes, issues, and gaps with the OAT framework. Some stakeholders indicated support generally for a transmission reservation process, while others went further and suggested design elements for a reservation process. And with those comments in mind, and based on our own assessment, and we'll talk about some of the benchmarking a bit later in this presentation, there's more of it in the issue paper, but we're proposing moving forward with development of a transmission reservation process as part of scope of the phase 2 of the initiative. And as you can probably expect, there's significant work ahead in designing the structure of a reservation process, and we will talk more about that in the subsequent slides. But a transmission reservation process could allow the ISO to reserve or set aside transmission capacity to serve native load needs, while also making transmission capacity available for other uses by other types of transactions needing access to our system and securing that high scheduling priority. And so to help further develop the structure of this framework, we're also proposing standing up collaborative stakeholder working groups. And we recognize that our regional partners across the Western Interconnection have been operating under a transmission reservation framework for more than 2 decades and have valuable experience and practices in that respect that we can leverage and learn from to help inform ultimately our own framework that is compatible with our market. And these working groups can also help build some consensus and ultimately help us move more quickly to a more robust framework than if the ISO were to do this on our own and issue, multiple iterations of proposals. I think we can really leverage the expertise and the collaborative nature of stakeholders to, really exchange ideas, exchange practices and experiences to help inform our framework. And I think ultimately will speed up the policy development process. And we're going to talk more about those working groups a little bit later in this presentation. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the areas that we saw stakeholder comment on were the principles that should guide the long-term framework development. In the July 13th workshop, we shared some initial principles for stakeholder feedback that we can build upon, and we received good and thoughtful feedback from stakeholders on those. Stakeholders generally shared suggestions on principles that emphasize a number of topics, such as, the importance of providing access to the transmission system consistent with open access principles, providing the ability to secure transmission or higher scheduling priority across different time frames that mesh more with the OAT framework, the concept of minimizing seams issues between our organized market and the OAT paradigm, the need to maintain the ability to reliably serve native load while also supporting reliable service across the West, and overall increasing ability to access our transmission system. So based on that feedback, we crafted the following guiding principles that we certainly appreciate, stakeholder feedback on. This will be one of the items that we'll ask for stakeholder feedback on when we publish the comments template. But based on the stakeholder feedback and the suggested principles, we kind of crafted the following suggested principles that should guide development of that framework. And I'll go through each one of these. So the framework should ensure that the ISO has the ability to reliably serve native load needs while providing non-discriminatory access to the transmission system consistent with open access principles. So this principle is fairly self-explanatory and I think captures the concept of reliable service to native loads while also recognizing and providing access to the transmission system for other transactions other than ISO load service. The second principle is that the framework should minimize seams issues between the ISO organized market and the OAT framework, which is prevalent across the West. We want to talk more about the seams issues in the next slide, I think, but we do recognize there are seams issues between how priority is established in the ISO market and how it's established under the OAT, and that the framework that we ultimately develop should try to minimize these seams issues and minimize the gaps. The third principle is that the framework should support reliable load service in the ISO and across the Western Balancing Authority areas. In other words, this may be a little bit more granular and an outcome of that first principle, but this recognizes that the ISO depends on its systems to serve native load reliably, while also recognizing that other balancing authority areas and load serving entities also depend on our system as well to meet those same reliability needs. And the framework should support the concept of reliable load service. The fourth principle is that the framework should not deter or inhibit competitive trades. The framework should not have an adverse impact on the ability of parties to transact and trade, whether it's in the ISO market or outside. The fifth principle is that the framework should ensure that the ISO has the tools and the processes necessary to manage the grid reliably. And effectively, the framework should not ultimately have an adverse impact on our ability to reliably operate the grid. And then the sixth framework that we've laid out here is that, the sixth principle that we've laid out is that the framework should strive to maintain the efficiencies of the ISO market in dispatching resources to serve load and meet market needs. Effectively, what we're trying to get at is that the framework should consider the structure of the ISO market and be compatible with that market structure while achieving all the other principled elements that we noted above. So as we work on developing the structure of this framework, I think we should keep these principles in mind and circle back to them periodically to ensure consistency of the structure of this transmission reservation process with these principles. And since we're at the issue paper stage as well, we certainly invite comments from stakeholders on these principles, these comments that are due at the end of the month. And we can certainly make any additional adjustments that are needed or embellish on these a bit more based on that stakeholder feedback. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I want to spend just a little bit of time as well on some of the key seams issues that we see and that some of them have been identified in comments and based on our own research. So a transmission reservation process for establishing scheduled priority in our market can help bridge some of these key seams issues with the OAT framework. First, a transmission reservation process can allow for the securing of scheduling priority across different time horizons on the ISO system. So for example, a party with a power purchase agreement, whether it's a long-term or a short-term power purchase agreement, they could reserve transmission across intervening systems under the OAT across different time frames to support delivery of that generation to load. And they could do the same across the ISO system under a transmission reservation process. For example, in anticipated tight system conditions, an external entity may procure generation on a daily basis and seek to secure high priority high scheduling priority across our system on a daily basis, subject to availability of that transmission. And I think providing the opportunity to secure high scheduling priority through a reservation process across the same time intervals as parties can secure under the oath should provide the opportunity then to obtain that higher certainty across the full path from source to sink. The second theme issue is that this forward transmission reservation process could address is that a reservation process would include the ability for the ISO to study requests for long-term transmission service to the extent these cannot be accommodated, and to determine whether a system upgrade is needed to accommodate that request. External transmission needs today have limited ability to drive upgrades on the ISO system. But by creating this process to study requests for potential upgrades, if these requests for long-term service cannot be accommodated, it can also bridge a seam issue with the OAT paradigm, because the OAT provides parties the same ability to secure high scheduling priority on a long-term basis to support their transactions. So parties that want to secure high scheduling priority on a long-term basis for their transactions, they could support system upgrades across our system that would provide that higher level of certainty for their transactions. So having now laid out the principles and a couple of key themes issues, let me just turn to the key components of the forward transmission reservation process that we will need to evaluate. And I'm going to pause after this next slide for comments. I want to walk through the principles, the themes issue, and now the key components of the framework, because they all build on each other. And then we can pause for questions at that point. Okay. So, this is by no means an exhaustive list of key components that a forward transmission reservation process needs to consider and that we'll need to evaluate. As we delve into each one of these, there will be other topics that arise that we will need to consider, and especially as we get into the different stakeholder working groups, I'm sure we'll identify other issues that need to be considered. But we wanted to capture at least some of the key elements that are key to the development of that reservation process. So a key aspect is determining, obviously, the amount of transmission capacity that's needed to serve native load needs and meet existing commitments. This will need to be done across likely different time horizons, both in the long-term and the short-term time frames, in order to bridge those seams issues that I talked about on the previous slide. Along those same lines, there will be a need to calculate the available transmission capacity, or ATC, that is available to support requests for transmission service that want to secure that high scheduling priority. This is also done across different time horizons and is dependent upon the calculation of existing commitments, including native load needs, as well as potential margins that may be needed as part of that methodology. We will also need to consider the type of transmission products offered and the time frames across which these are offered, and the process for requesting and reserving transmission service. This is a key item, again, in bridging those seams with the OAT framework of having the ability to reserve transmission across different time frames and secure that high scheduling priority if that transmission can be reserved. We will also need to consider a process for studying requests that cannot be accommodated, and these requests may potentially drive upgrades across the system to secure that high scheduling priority on a long-term basis. Effectively, the parties that want this service, they'll have the opportunity to seek a study, and then ultimately, depending on the results of that study, they'll have the opportunity to choose to pursue an upgrade. And those studies will be particularly focused on long-term requests for transmission service. So this is a year or longer, and that high scheduling priority, securing of that high scheduling priority if there's not sufficient transmission already that can accommodate that need. When transmission is ultimately reserved, we need to consider what is it ultimately the parties are receiving? What's the value proposition here? Aside from securing the higher scheduling priority for reserving that transmission in advance, should the parties also be eligible to be allocated congestion revenue rights and what is the duration of service that should trigger that eligibility. I think in the issue paper, we outlined some of the different practices of other ISOs and RTOs in this respect, and they allow or they make parties eligible for congestion revenue rights or their equivalent concept if transmission service is reserved on a long-term basis or potentially monthly, but really nothing lower than that, because I don't think they, similar to us, we really allocate these rights on a long-term and a monthly basis as well. So we'll need to consider this as well as what are parties getting when they reserve that transmission and they're paying for it. They're getting the high scheduling priority, but should there also be eligibility for an allocation of congestion revenue rights? And ultimately, based upon the progress on some of the items above and the nature of the transmission product, software, and qualities, we would need to review the rate structure and consider whether the same singular tax charge that's in place today should remain and is paid for the duration of the service, or should there be a different rate structure? And I think, again, this is informed by ultimately the structure of the process that we develop in the different products and the time frames across which parties can reserve that scheduling priority. And finally, I know it's not necessarily on this slide, but a key thing that we will need to consider is whether there's a transition process to this new framework, or is there a cutoff date on which we move to this new process? I think we really need to be mindful of that. This will be an important item to consider. And I think, again, this is informed by the ultimately the structure of the reservation process that we develop, and the implementation. This has the ability to affect the implementation timing as well. But I will talk more about that implementation and the phase 2 timeline a bit later. But I think the transition process, once we have better outlined the structure of the process, how we reserve transmission for native load, across what time frames is transmission made available for reservation, and what are the products, I think that will then at that point inform and help us discuss better what is that transition process to this new framework that we can talk about. As I noted, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. As we delve further into the details, there will be topics within each one of these categories that will emerge and we'll need to consider as well. Okay, let's then pause for questions here. We've covered the principles, we've covered the themes issues, and we've covered the key components at this stage of the forward reservation process that we think need to be addressed. But let's pause here for questions on this phase 2 scope, and we'll discuss the stakeholder working group next, and a view of the benchmarking of other ISO and RTO practices that have a forward transmission reservation process in place. Let's open it up for questions.
Okay, once again, you may use the WebEx raise hand icon located above the chat, or you can dial #2 on your telephone keypad to ask a question. And we're currently seeing no incoming questions.
Okay. Well, maybe we can move on to the next slide, and maybe as people are thinking about questions, we'll make sure that we pause towards the end. After the next couple of slides, we'll have another opportunity for questions. So as you're thinking, feel free to raise your hand and ask anything. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the collaborative stakeholder working group approach that we're hoping really to leverage to help us further develop the structure of this transmission reservation process. We're proposing establishing these working groups fairly quickly. These working groups would be comprised of external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, and ISO staff. And through the working groups, we're really looking to leverage the experience and the practices of our regional partners in operating a transmission reservation process and helping inform our development of that process. As I think about it, the external entities that are operating under the old framework, they all need to, they all set aside transmission capacity and have a method for calculating how much transmission and the different inputs for determining the native load needs and the transmission capacity that needs to be set aside for those native load needs and network load needs. So I think this will help us really leverage those experiences, help inform what type of information and assumptions are generally made, and ultimately can be something that helps inform what we may do based on the information that we have access to and that we could seek. This process, I think the collaborative stakeholder working groups will help us move forward with phase 2 more timely than if the ISO were to evaluate this process on its own in a vacuum. We don't operate under this framework today. There's a number of complex issues that if we were to do this on our own, we would be going, I'll exaggerate here, but through countless iterations of proposals in order to get stakeholder feedback. And I think these stakeholder working groups can help us really leverage that expertise, have us all together talk through some of these thorny issues and ultimately help inform the different proposals that the ISO may issue. We have 3 working groups at this stage that we're proposing. We're not foreclosing the need or development of additional working groups at a later stage, but I think these are the critical ones that will help us really shape the structure of this framework. The first working group, and more details are provided on this in the issue paper, but the first working group will be focused on the calculation of transmission capacity that's needed to reliably serve native load, as well as the calculation of available transfer capability, the ATC, that ultimately is what is available for other reservations across our system and securing that higher scheduling priority. In the issue paper, we describe the scope a bit more in detail, but it focuses really on understanding the different practices of external entities regarding inputs and assumptions for calculating native load needs, accounting for different types of uncertainty when it comes to service to native load, and ultimately calculating the ATC that is available for other transactions. The focus is also on those calculations and assumptions across different time horizons. We talked about a key theme issue being the ability to allow for reservations across and securing of that higher scheduling priority across different time horizons. Well, that also means then being able to calculate what is the available transmission that can be reserved across those different time horizons, both in the long-term and the short-term time frames. There will also need to be discussions on, and we're hoping that there's some discussion on systems and the tools that parties currently use to support these types of calculation, particularly from the external entities, to help us just get a better sense of the extent of the different tools and systems that may come in play, whether these are, in-house developed systems and tools that parties use, or if there's some off-the-shelf products that are utilized to support these calculations. I think, we can do those same types of outreaches with ISOs and other ISOs and RTOs, but I think it will give us a good sense of what are parties across the West utilizing to support these types of assessments. Ultimately, the group will also evaluate the type of information that the ISO may utilize to calculate native load needs and ATC across its system, which would inform our proposal. There may be other relevant topics that arise during the course of these discussions that may need to be considered, and we can certainly be open to addressing those within the stakeholder working groups. The second working group will focus more broadly on transmission products and the process for reserving transmission service. This group would focus on the products that should be offered, the time increments across which parties can reserve the service, process for requesting transmission service, and ultimately the process for evaluating those requests to determine if these can be awarded. Is there sufficient ATC to accommodate those types of requests? This would again also include some discussion on systems and tools that support this type of a process, just to give us a sense of what are different parties from a systems perspective utilizing. It can ultimately help inform the implementation of these different components in this structure. We'll nevertheless obviously do our own assessment based on how the structure is shaping for what are the systems and the tools needed. But I think having some discussion in these working groups will help inform, give us a better sense of what's utilized out there. The third working group then will focus on the process for studying requests that cannot be accommodated and the process for pursuing upgrades in response to those studies. So this includes both the process for requesting a study by a market participant to the extent, for example, that they've requested long-term service to obtain that higher scheduling priority, but we do not have enough ATC on a long-term basis to accommodate that need. That party would then have the ability to request a study from the ISO, and we would evaluate what does that study process entail, how is it compatible, how we can make it compatible with our current transmission planning process, as well as the process ultimately if the party does want to pursue an upgrade, what's the process and the requirements to pursuing that upgrade, what do parties ultimately get when they move forward with that upgrade, and what are the potential financial or other commitments that would support proceeding with an upgrade. I expect a little bit about the logistics. I expect that we will start these working groups in October, as early as October, and we can coordinate with the different participants that identify a desire to participate in these working groups. We can coordinate the logistics of meetings based on the availability of those different participants. But I think it's important to recognize where we're hoping to for active engagement in these working groups from stakeholders that can really help dedicate time and the appropriate staff for these collaborative discussions. And I think it's also important to hit the ground running as soon as possible. The only reason I'm noting here October is because, stakeholder comments are due at the end of September. We need some time for stakeholders to indicate interest, and based on that interest, then we'll reach out and start forming these different working groups and engaging the different stakeholders. By all means, if you're interested or your organization is interested in actively participating in these working groups, please indicate that interest. We've noted how to do that in the issue paper, and Christina will go over that at the end of the meeting when we're talking about the next steps. How do you notify us that you want to participate in a working group, and in which working group to note that. Let's go to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit about the practices of the different ISOs and RTOs with a forward transmission reservation process. Because aside from these stakeholder working groups, these practices and of these different ISOs and RTOs really can also help inform the structure of a transmission reservation process. We reached out, and we go into more detail in the issue paper, but we reached out to 5 ISOs and RTOs through a series of discussions to better understand their practices and how they establish the different scheduling priorities. And these 5 entities were PJM, MISO, SPP, New York ISO, and ISO New England. PJM, MISO, and SPP have a forward transmission reservation process in place, and I wanted to focus on these today, since we'll be moving forward with a forward transmission reservation process ourselves as part of Phase 2. New York ISO and ISO New England do not have a transmission reservation process in place currently, and we describe in more detail their practice in the issue paper. But these 2 entities have a much lower demand for wheels across their system, and have not yet had a need as a result of this low volume and the different conditions on their system to address this issue more robustly of a priority framework as we have to address it today. For example, ISO New England has a handful of wheels across their system across the entire calendar year, due primarily to their geographic location. And we share a map of that, of the ISOs and RTOs, and I think it becomes evident once you take a look at where they're located. But also New York ISO is fairly similar. While they do have a higher volume of wheels, those are still fairly limited. There's limitations on the amount of megawatts, and there's certain agreements as to how much is dedicated to wheel-through transactions. So I wanted to provide a focus on the comparison between the ISOs and RTOs that have a transmission reservation process in place today as part of the presentation today. But we certainly, if any questions arise or are there any comments on the other processes, by all means, note that as well in your comments. So hopefully everybody can see the matrix or the simplified matrix. There's a more robust matrix in the issue paper, but I wanted to, take out some of the key aspects and share those here. So we'll be focusing on PJM, MISO, and SPP. All three of these entities require a transmission reservation in order to offer into the market. And while their transmission reservation process is largely based on the OAT, they do have variations among them in a number of areas and deviations from the standard OAT process. For example, while they all require forward transmission reservation service, for a forward transmission reservation to offer into the market, MISO allows for offers into the real-time market without a reservation, a transmission reservation. But that transaction then has the lowest priority in the market when it comes to curtailments. It's got a priority equivalent to non-firm hourly transmission service. And they offer transmission service among these three entities, both point-to-point and network transmission service across different time frames, firm and non-firm. And these then set the priorities for curtailment purposes. When the market cannot solve and the transactions then need to be curtailed, these curtailments then go in based on the type of transmission service that's been reserved in the market, with non-firm of shortest duration having the lowest priority, and then going up in order until firm service has the highest priority. And this is firm service of any duration has the highest curtailment priority, scheduling priority. They all set aside as well or reserve transmission capacity for native load and or network load as an existing transmission commitment ahead of making ATC available for sale to other transactions. And in calculating the native load needs or the network load needs, this is very much based on different inputs and assumptions across different time horizons. Because they do offer transmission service across different time horizons, there's a need to calculate those commitments and ultimately the available transmission capacity for reservation across those different horizons. But overall, they have a fairly similar approach. They utilize, obviously, load forecasts in the different time horizons. It's one type of a load forecast in the long-term horizon, and if you get a bit closer in time, those load forecasts are updated with more based on the more recent conditions. And they ultimately also create a generation stack, for lack of a better term, that is studied as serving the forecasted load based on whichever forecast is used to determine ultimately the transmission capacity across the system that needs to be set aside for those native load needs. And this generation stack is almost exclusively, in their cases, made up of resources that are internal to the system due to the limited reliance on imports that they have. They look at the qualities and performance of internal resources, and they all take into account different factors. They look at outages, online time, and potentially other factors that they consider. And they look at those factors over the last year or some other longer time frame and stack the resources then based on those factors from most dependable to less dependable resource in determining that generation stack that will ultimately be used and studied as serving the load based on the forecast that's utilized. And ultimately, what that leads to is some amount of transmission capacity across different flow gates that needs to be reserved for native load or network load needs. And I think this is the key topic that we will ultimately have to determine in our own reservation process. What are those generation assumptions based upon and across the different time frames? What are they based upon in determining ultimately the transmission capacity that's needed to be set aside as serving that native load? There are also some nuanced differences when it comes to the transmission studies for long-term requests, whereas MISO and SPP study requests over a year or longer. If those cannot be accommodated, if there's not sufficient ATC, that will study those in order to determine whether an upgrade is needed. PJM effectively will only study requests of 5 years or longer to determine potential system upgrade needs. In other words, PJM would not trigger a study or a system expansion unless that entity is seeking long-term service that is willing to essentially commit to a minimum term of 5 years or longer. And then regarding the capacity benefit margin, or CBM, this is the transmission capacity that's set aside for imports in energy emergencies to serve load. This is the transmission capacity that's needed to support those imports in an energy emergency to serve load. And that's set aside as a CBM, capacity benefit margin, under the ATC methodology. PJM and MISO have a margin, while SPP does not. And this also depends on the robustness of the different assumptions within the ATC methodology and robustness of assumptions and accounting for uncertainty for native load needs within those calculations. That can lead to driving the need for a CBM or not. And if those assumptions are robust enough in other areas of the methodology and account for the different uncertainties and realities of the system sufficiently, there may not be a need for a CBM, but this is a very kind of system specific based upon the different risks and conditions and uncertainties across that particular system that drive the need to consider setting aside transmission capacity as CBM. So I think this information can be very useful in helping design a framework that is compatible with our market and provide some insights into how native load needs are calculated based on realities of their system. And this can all help inform our process. And I think when we get into the stakeholder working groups, particularly on the native load calculation, I think we'll find, fair amount of similarity in ultimately that there's a need to consider different types of generation assumptions in serving load. And what we'll need to determine is, what are those generation assumptions informed by? What is the information that the ISO has and that the California load serving entities can provide to help inform ultimately that determination of native load needs? Okay, let's then shift then to the schedule for phase 2, and then we'll pause for comments on some of these phase 2 items that we talked about. So we're going to be, as I noted earlier, we're going to be running both phases of the initiative concurrently, with phase 1 going to the board in March and phase 2 continuing beyond that. And what I mean when I say we're going to be running these concurrently is that when we publish the straw proposal for phase 1 in late October, we will also have an update on phase 2. We will always strive to have some information and updates moving the ball forward, moving the framework forward on phase 2. And I envision that by the time that we publish the straw proposal for phase 1 at the end of October, we will be able to provide an update on some of the work from the different working groups that help shape the transmission reservation process. We may not have a straw proposal by October, but I think we will definitely need to have an update from the different working groups that just indicates, again, how are we moving this process forward, what have been discussing, and where are things looking like they're going. Ultimately, we will, when we publish the draft final proposal for phase 1 in December, we will also be, at that point in time, we're targeting having a straw proposal for this phase 2 based on the outcome from the work from the different working groups. It will help inform a straw proposal on phase 2 on different elements of the concept. I think it's also important for us to hit the ground running. We're dedicating significant resources across the organization on this phase 2 effort and supporting the different stakeholder working groups. I think, if you just look at on this WebEx as well, if you look at the number of folks from the ISO that are on the panel, we have a fairly robust group of folks across different areas of the organization with very good experience that are working with us on developing this phase 2 framework. So we want to make meaningful progress on developing the structure of the transmission reservation process promptly. And as we go through this process, we will keep an eye on the initiative timeline. Our goal is really to have a transmission reservation framework well-defined with different qualities and attributes by next summer. That's our really target. At which point, based on the nature of that holistic framework and the structure of that process, we can then reevaluate the timeline and consider any remaining items, particularly as well turn our attention to a transition process to this defined reservation process framework. So at this stage, while our estimate is that we will be taking phase 2 to the board for decision in March of 2023 with implementation early 2024, this is just an estimate at this particular stage. As part of that transition process discussion, we will need to jointly consider when we want that new framework to take effect and what is that transition process like. But we need to recognize this is a new process for reserving transmission service and has a number of components that will require likely extensive system enhancements to support a reservation process. And this may vary based upon the complexity of the structure of that reservation process. So I'm expecting that we can take stock again on where we are and the reservation process structure that we will have developed by next summer and reconsider the timeline and adjust it as needed while considering that transition process may need to be based on ultimately the structure of that reservation process that we've outlined and laid out in the summer. So let's pause then here for questions either on, we covered the working groups, we covered the benchmarking, and now we covered the schedule. Any of those three topics, if there are any questions. And then, after we go through the next couple of slides, we'll pause again on any questions overall on what we've discussed today. But let me pause here on any questions on what we covered here.
Okay, as a reminder, you can dial #2 on your telephone keypad if you dialed in separately, or you may use the WebEx raise hand icon located above the chat. And it looks like we have a couple of folks waiting. I'll go to the first.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. Was that me you just unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good, thanks. So Bonnie Blair, representing the 6 Cities group. I have some questions about the working group concept, I guess. And I think there are some obvious advantages to it, but to the extent that you get more expressions of interest than you think are going to be consistent with the process that you have in mind. You mentioned in the issue paper that you may end up deciding to limit participation in the working groups. I guess there are 2 questions that arise in my mind with that suggestion. One is, what are the criteria that you're going to apply to decide how to choose who you want to have participate in the working groups? Question 1. And then question 2 is, how will you, to the extent that you limit participation, how are you going to ensure the same degree of transparency in the process and the outcome of the process that typically applies in your initiatives? And it's obvious to me that this initiative is one in which there is a great deal of interest throughout the entire region. So I think that there is a significant possibility that you're going to end up with more expressions of interest than you think might be optimal, and how are you going to handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bonnie, and that's not necessarily something that we've thought through too much in detail about. What ultimately there's some, I think in the paper we did note, what we're trying to do with these stakeholder working groups is really to keep it to a manageable number that we can have some of the robust discussions between the different groups from each other's perspectives. But the other key is we also want to make sure that we foster and encourage particularly external entities to share some of their practices in that smaller group setting. My only concern is with limiting the working groups is that we don't necessarily, some of the parties may not be as willing to share some of their practices by opening it up to a loop, to opening those up to a large swath of the Western interconnection, in any detail. And so by limiting it to smaller groups, we're really trying to encourage sharing of information, sharing of practices to help us learn from those. But, I don't think ultimately that the limit is, I think it's a soft limit. I think we'll have to evaluate how many stakeholders we get. I think we've tried to encourage maybe 10 different organizations. They can have multiple folks from different organizations from that same organizations participating, because we recognize that there may be a need for participants from the transmission function, the merchant function, from some of the external entities in particular. But I'm really hoping that we don't necessarily have to limit those groups. So, we'll think about that a little bit more, Bonnie. That's a fair question to ask. I'm hoping that we get a sense of interest from the amount of organizations, and if it's more than 10 organizations that express interest, I think we can still make it work. It just the concern I think would arise if all of a sudden we have 50 different organizations that want to participate in a working group. At that point, it may need to be something that's broadened a bit more, in a stakeholder, holding a stakeholder meeting. But so my suggestion, let's wait and see how much interest we get and cross that bridge when we get there, sharing. At that point, if it gets significant interest beyond, what we think it fosters that, meaningful and manageable discussion, we may need to reconsider that particular working group and have a more stakeholder meeting-like discussion for that particular topic. That's one option. But on your second point, can you remind me what that second question was?
It's kind of a follow-up. So to the extent that you do limit the participation by, in other words, you exclude some people who were interested in participating, how are you going to ensure transparency? How are you going to give interested stakeholders comfort that that they've got the big picture of the dialogue that has gone on?
Yeah, and so one of the ways that we could do that, and that's what I was kind of alluding to with the publication of, when in late October when we published the phase 1 straw proposal, I'm envisioning that for phase 2 we will capture a report about the work from the different working groups and what's been discussed, and at a high level highlighting some of the different practices and what we've learned from it that can help ultimately inform our proposal. So that's one way that we can provide some reports from those different working groups and make that available in the subsequent papers we publish. I think that's one way, but I think ultimately we expect that whatever comes out of these working groups will ultimately help inform, and the CAISO will have the ability to use that information to inform a straw proposal, and that straw proposal as well then will be vetted with the broader stakeholder community. And in justifying that straw proposal, I'm envisioning, us going into some level of detail about what was discussed in those working groups to help support ultimately where we ended with a proposal. But that's a fair point as well that we'll, I'll have to consider.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we'll take the next caller.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, this is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. I won't belabor this, but I did have some similar concerns to Bonnie, and that was why I had raised my hand as well to kind of ask a little bit about that limitation on these working groups and the transparency issues. So hopefully, maybe, I guess I wasn't completely sure about what you meant by limiting it, as far as maybe limiting the number of presenters, or if it was planned to be, like a public open meeting, like a normal stakeholder meeting in other working groups that CAISO have had, previously. And then I have some suggestions about maybe the format, but do you have any thoughts to maybe clarify on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I was originally thinking that these would be, kind of offline, working group meetings with the participants of the different stakeholder working groups. And again, that's primarily to foster some discussion and encourage information sharing about different practices, whereas parties may not probably be as willing to share, put their practices under the loop in a broader stakeholder forum, but primarily have those discussions to learn offline and inform those participants in the working group so that we can better think through each one of those issues. And then subsequently, there would be reports and subsequent papers about what we discussed and how did that information help inform the proposal. But that's what I was thinking. If ultimately, I think if we do get significant interest in some of the working groups, that is, really shows there's, a good sizable amount of different organizations that are interested in participating in those working groups, I think it would make sense at that point to, just have a, regular stakeholder working group meeting just open to everybody that's, limited to that particular scope item. We would just need to be careful and work with external parties that are sharing information, that it's something that they are willing to share, that it doesn't necessarily detract from their participation. But I think this all ultimately comes down to how much interest we get from participants in these working groups. I was envisioning we may not get as much interest for stakeholders or different market participants to be part of each one of these working groups, but if we do get significant interest, I think definitely at that point, rather than us issuing some kind of a hard cap, it may make sense to open it up and to just tailor the discussion, recognizing that this is something that's can be called in by any stakeholder.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. So I would encourage you to just open it up directly. I realize that there's some, efficiencies and trade-offs to be gained, perhaps, with folks that might not want to discuss some of the details. But I think a lot of this stuff should be pretty well and open and transparent in the other oat tariffs and everything like that. So, I would encourage the CAISO to try to keep this as a fully open, transparent process. Obviously, you can have offline discussions with individual, entities if you need to have more direct input. But I do think we would benefit from everyone being in those discussions and being able to chime in and have some ability to ask questions more directly of the presenters.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my input. And then just to maybe put a finer point on that, just in a reaction to kind of how the first workshop went. I thought there was a lot of good information that was presented by the different parties that were part of that workshop. Unfortunately, it didn't really seem like there was enough time for it to really be very much of a discussion. It was more just simply a presentation. And then the CAISO asked some questions, maybe the MSC members asked a few questions, but there was really no dialogue between the stakeholders. So I guess I would encourage during these workshops to try to schedule it so that there's enough time for people to really have an open dialogue and have more of a back and forth about it and debate the points and try to, provide some more background and context for everyone to understand where everyone else is coming from and the background and nuance of these different issues. So that's just my thoughts on that, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
We'll move to the next caller.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. Actually, I think that last conversation might make my comment somewhat moot, but the idea or the thought that I had in my head when you are talking about having 3 different working groups, each with a specific topic to work on, is within one of those working groups, if something were to come up, or maybe that group was going down a line of thinking that might potentially have an interplay or interaction with something that another group is working on, if there's an opportunity there for some sort of communication between the three groups. That was my initial reaction, but I think hearing that maybe this is now going to be more of an open dialogue with a lot of the same stakeholders being able to participate in all three of those working group conversations, then maybe it's not that big of a concern. Yeah. But just if you guys can keep that in the back of your mind as you're kind of fleshing out the details on how this would work, because I think having them completely siloed might, cause some issues down the road as all three groups come together to form the one larger proposal.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we'll keep that in mind. I think in the issue paper we noted that, I think we noted some of or we suggested that to the extent that we went, go down the route of these separate, discrete working groups, some overlap between participants in working group 1 and 2 in particular. But that's a great point, and please note that in your comments, because ultimately, what we're hearing today is it may lend itself better if we did some of these working groups more publicly, which I think we're definitely open to that. We'll just need to think about the logistics a little bit. My hope was with these smaller working groups, we can get more often together, and have, multiple discussions across different periods. We just may need to do something similar, but with the wider stakeholder community. So that's something we can certainly consider, and point is well taken about making these more open and, stakeholder-like meetings, but really focused on these discrete topics.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead and take the next caller.
Hey, Milos, this is Michelle Kita from the CPUC again. I just wanted to comment on the timeline. So I know that is in flux, but if you had a governing board meeting in March of 2023, you would still have to go to FERC to get it approved. So it doesn't really seem like it would be possible, since you still have to conduct the studies, and, potentially there's allocation of CRRs or other things that would occur, that it would actually be implementable in 2024. So if you really wanted it to be implementable in 2024, I guess one question is, when would you really need governing board approval, and when would you need to go to FERC? And then if it does get delayed until 2023 for the governing board, are you really having the short-term solution in place for potentially another 2 or maybe even 3 years, in which case, do you think the short-term solution is robust enough to ensure reliability across the grid?
Thanks, Michelle, for that. So on the first question, like you said, and I think as I noted, we're going to be reevaluating this timeline as we go through it and we further develop the framework through these working groups, which may become ultimately some of the public stakeholder working groups based on some of this feedback that we're hearing. But we'll constantly reevaluate that timeline. I think ultimately it depends upon, once we get to next summer and we have a good outline and a good layout of the structure of the framework, I think that will help inform ultimately, is March board meeting the decisional meeting, or is it some other timeline? That will really help it inform the scope and the implementation needs as well, to really evaluate how realistic is implementation in 2024. But the hope is, and this maybe gets as well to your second question as well, is we will need to have a discussion on a transition process. And, that transition process, depending on how we ultimately structure this framework by next summer, is, we'll need to evaluate what that transition process is. And that transition process could potentially, include some aspects of that framework. We'll just need to collaboratively think through, what's the best way to ultimately transition to that robust, reservation process that we developed? Is it something, is it implementation of something lesser, but it's consistent with where we're going and takes aspects of that framework into account? And could that be implementable ahead of that summer of 2023 so that, we kind of implement this in phases that based on whatever that transition process is. So I think ultimately my answer to your second question is, I think we will continue working with stakeholders to improve the robustness of this current scheduling priority framework as we build to the implementation of this long-term framework. And, that robustness and those enhancements may look different and may build upon further on the enhancements that we do this year, but may be different for 2023 summer, depending upon where we end up in structuring this transmission reservation process framework by next summer. I don't know if that made sense, but the idea is that we will continue building upon this framework as we transition to this robust reservation process, and there'll be opportunities as we better outline this particular framework by next summer. We can then talk about transitioning to that framework and what does that transition look like? Is it implementation of different aspects of it for summer of 2023 until we build to full implementation at some point later, depending on what that timeline is? Or is it further building upon the framework that we have currently in place?
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Do we have anybody else in the queue?
We currently have no one else in the queue.
Okay. Well, let's then go to the next slide, and I promise we'll let you all out of here fairly soon. Okay, slide 29. This is the decisional classification. Okay, so on the EIM decisional classification for these phases of the initiative, so what we're proposing is that the EIM governing body have an advisory role for both phase 1 and phase 2 of the initiative. You may remember in August of this year, the ISO Board of Governors and the governing body jointly adopted the proposal of the Governance Review Committee, which established that the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body have joint authority over items that change or establish ISO tariff rules that are applicable to the EIM entity balancing authority areas, EIM entities, or other market participants within the EIM balancing authority areas in their capacity as participants in the EIM. So both phases 1 and 2 of this initiative, this stage would adjust, really are looking at adjusting the tariff rules that govern whether and to what extent schedules across the ISO receive priority on our system. And these priorities would not be applicable to EIM entities or EIM balancing authority areas in their capacity as participants in the EIM. So the proposal is for the EIM governing body role on an advisory role on both phases. Now, this classification is based upon this initial stage and scope, and as we progress further with the development of the different phases, we can continue to evaluate that classification. But let me pause here for questions on this item, and let's also open it up at this stage of the presentation to any questions on the initiative overall, to the extent somebody didn't get to ask a question, any lingering questions before we turn it over to Christina on the next steps.
Okay, as an additional reminder, you can dial #2 on your telephone keypad if you dialed in separately. If you use the WebEx information, feel free to use the raise hand icon located above the chat. And it seems we're currently not receiving any questions.
Okay. Well, with that, we've concluded the substantive portion of the discussion of the presentation. And before I turn it over to Christina, I just wanted to thank you all for joining today and encourage you to reach out to us with any questions ahead of the comment deadline we can certainly help answer any questions or provide any clarifications on the issue paper that will help you submit comments by September 30th. I think we also got some good feedback on the structure of the stakeholder working group. Sounds like there is more of a desire that these be open stakeholder working groups that, similarly, we can run them as our stakeholder meetings, but there'll be more focused on these particular different elements, and any stakeholder could participate in and listen into that discussion. I think we're certainly open to that. The goal with the stakeholder working groups is really to have a focused discussion and take some of these bits and pieces of the process in different chunks to help really develop that structure. And I think that is still consistent with that open and having it like as a stakeholder meeting. It's still consistent with what we're trying to do. So please note that in your comments as well, and we'll certainly consider that. We may, for these stakeholder working groups, again, I think in order to get the most out of them, there may be relatively frequent on the different phases, on the different scope items. But I think, nevertheless, even not doing it in a small group structure, but broadening it so that any stakeholder can call in, I think that is still consistent with what we want to do. It's just that we, external parties, as they're sharing their experiences, they may need, and their practices, we may need to just be a little bit more careful about that information, and it may need to be a little bit more general. But I think that still can help support moving these different phases and working groups forward. So I think we certainly heard you on that, and there were a number of good suggestions as part of phase one as well when we discussed it that we'll consider. And we encourage you to put all that in comments, and we'll definitely consider it. There's an opportunity, since we're at the issue paper stage, as I said at the beginning, there may be some additional items added to the scope based on your feedback that we get here. So the next stage is the straw proposal, and we'll certainly consider those comments, and we'll be in touch. We'll let you know ultimately how we'll proceed with these stakeholder working groups. But I think we definitely heard you that this is something that any stakeholder that wants to participate in should be able to participate in. Okay. I think I've spoken enough for today. Like I said, we really appreciate you participating, and we look forward to working with you on all of these items as we go forward in the initiative. These are thorny items, challenging items, but we certainly think that these are important issues that I think all of us working together, we can definitely get through it. So, Christina, I'll turn it over to you to cover the next steps. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Milo. Okay, so we will post a comment template so you can submit comments on the issue paper and the meeting discussion that we had today. That should be available in the next couple of days. We are asking you to submit those by end of day September 30th. So, we do have a note here about if you're interested in participating in a working group, you can contact ISO Stakeholder Affairs. We'll kind of keep going forward with that until we do get comments on the issue paper, and then we can reevaluate at that time. So I did provide a link to the initiative webpage here, and then if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me directly, or you can also send it to ISO Stakeholder Affairs mailbox, and someone from my team will respond or forward that email to me. And so just one more slide, this is just for information purposes only. I just wanted to plug our Energy Matters blog. This is a blog that we started earlier this year, I think before summer. And so these are, this replaces the newsletter that we used to put out. We post blogs quite often, and just to provide some timely information on matters impacting ISO grid and market operations, as well as other hot topics in the industry. And so here's a link to the blog page, and I also provided a sample article here regarding the resource efficiency evaluation. We do have an active initiative on that, so there is an article, and coincidentally, it was written by Milos, so I provided a hyperlink to this image, so you can access it either there or through the blog page. And then we also, if you want to just subscribe to the monthly summary, there's a link here for that as well. So any other comments on process-related items or anything else that you wanted to ask before we conclude today? Again, you can either press the hand raise icon or the raised hand icon above the chat window, or you can press #2 if you dialed into the meeting. No questions, Marvin? Hopefully everybody can hear me.
Not seeing anything at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate the feedback that you gave us today. We do encourage you to submit those in your written comments, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.